Across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, countless enslaved Africans were forced onto ships under unimaginable conditions. The journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of overcrowding, disease, and extreme deprivation. Women and children were packed tightly into the holds of ships, often chained together with little room to move, and subjected to harsh treatment that stripped them of dignity and freedom. Malnutrition and disease spread quickly in these confined spaces, turning voyages into deadly ordeals for many. Yet, even in the face of relentless suffering, acts of courage and defiance emerged. Enslaved Africans resisted in ways both visible and subtle through organized uprisings. Sabotaging equipment, refusing to eat, or attempting escape. These acts were extraordinary, a testament to the resilience and unyielding spirit of people determined to reclaim their humanity. Each moment of resistance challenged the cruel systems designed to oppress them and left a mark on history that continues to inspire us today. In this story, we explore the bravery and ingenuity of those who dared to fight back at sea, risking everything for freedom. Their struggles are not just historical events, they are powerful reminders of the strength of the human spirit in the darkest circumstances. If you want to uncover more stories of courage, resilience, and untold history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Every story shared helps us honor those who fought against oppression and ensures that their legacy lives on. Join us as we dive deep into the remarkable history of resistance at sea. As the ships cut through the endless blue of the Atlantic, the enslaved Africans below deck lived in a world that was suffocating, dark, and terrifying. The air was thick with the stench of human suffering, sweat, and sickness. And yet within this grim reality, the human spirit refused to be entirely extinguished. Some found ways to fight back in ways that were visible and daring, taking enormous risks to seize even the smallest measure of freedom. Open revolts occasionally erupted, with groups of enslaved men and women rising against their captors, armed with whatever tools or makeshift weapons they could find. These mutinies were terrifying not only for the crew but for the enslaved themselves, as any failure could mean brutal punishment or death. Yet the very act of resistance was an assertion of their humanity, a refusal to accept the chains that bound them. Others chose subtler, yet no less defiant, forms of resistance. Tools were sabotaged, ropes and shackles tampered with, and vital supplies deliberately destroyed or hidden. Even the food that was meant to sustain them became an instrument of defiance when some refused to eat or contaminated the provisions, forcing the crew to confront the power that the enslaved still held. Even in captivity, each act of sabotage was a quiet rebellion, a message that even in the most controlled environment, control could never be absolute. There were also those who resisted in ways that demanded patience, cunning, and endurance. Feigning illness or appearing weak could delay punishments, buying time to plan or observe, while secret attempts to escape even in the confines of a ship hundreds of miles from land revealed the audacity of hope. Some risked slipping into the shadows at night, moving through narrow spaces between decks, seeking a momentary lapse in vigilance that might allow them a chance at survival or freedom. These acts were often invisible to the casual observer but spoke volumes about resilience, determination, and the refusal to surrender one's agency entirely. Together, these forms of resistance, violent, subtle, and patient, formed a tapestry of courage that ran through the horrors of the Middle Passage. Each attempt to reclaim power, whether through a sudden uprising or a quiet act of defiance, was a profound assertion of identity and dignity in the face of a system designed to erase both. The bravery displayed was not without consequence, as crew members often responded with strict retaliation, punishing those involved to prevent others from following suit. Yet even the threat of punishment could not erase the spark of rebellion. The enslaved continued to find ways to resist, to assert their presence and humanity, leaving a legacy that would ripple through generations. The story of resistance at sea is not only about the moments of revolt that captured attention, but also about the endurance, cunning, and unyielding hope of people who, despite being treated as property, refused to be entirely subdued. Every act, whether monumental or small, was a declaration that freedom was worth the risk, and that the human spirit could persist even in the darkest and most confined spaces. In the shadowed holds of slave ships, courage was not only demonstrated through dramatic uprisings, but also through the daily, persistent refusal to accept oppression quietly, proving that even when the odds were insurmountable, the desire for dignity and autonomy could never be fully chained. Among the many stories of defiance on the treacherous waters of the Atlantic, few stand as vividly in history as the Amistad Revolt of 1839, an extraordinary instance in which enslaved Africans seized control of a ship and charted their own course toward freedom. These men, torn from their homeland and subjected to unimaginable suffering, refused to remain passive victims. In a daring act that would resonate across centuries, they overpowered the crew off the coast of Cuba, turning the instruments of their captivity into tools of liberation. The audacity of their actions was matched only by the precision with which they executed their plan, demonstrating remarkable courage, strategy, and unity, qualities forged under the relentless pressure of oppression and despair. The Amistad Uprising was far from an isolated incident, though it is among the best documented. Across the Atlantic, enslaved people repeatedly found ways to resist, often in coordinated, sometimes desperate attempts to seize control of the vessels that carried them. Captains and guards, armed and accustomed to unquestioned authority, were suddenly confronted with the unrelenting determination of those they sought to subjugate. These attacks, though fraught with danger, reflected careful planning and a profound understanding of the vulnerabilities of the ships themselves. Even temporary control of a vessel, achieved through such revolts, was a monumental assertion of agency, turning fear into action and desperation into strategy. What made these acts remarkable was not only the courage displayed in the moment, but the broader human story they revealed. Men and women who had endured the trauma of capture, the terror of confinement, and the daily indignities of enslavement demonstrated extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. They had to navigate not only the physical challenges of overpowering armed crew members, but also the psychological burden of confronting a world determined to erase their freedom and identity. Every successful maneuver, every decisive moment in which they gained the upper hand, symbolized a rejection of that imposed subjugation and an affirmation of their inherent dignity. The consequences of these uprisings were as dramatic as the events themselves. While some revolts ended in tragic failure, often resulting in brutal retaliation, the stories of those who survived, like the leaders of the Amistad, inspired countless others. News of successful acts of resistance spread across continents, igniting hope and fueling the abolitionist movement, showing that even in the most oppressive circumstances, courage could create real change. The legal battles and public attention that followed the Amistad Revolt, for instance, highlighted the humanity and rights of those who had been enslaved, forcing the world to confront the moral and ethical implications of the slave trade. The legacy of these maritime revolts is therefore not confined to the ships themselves but extends into history as a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the unyielding desire for freedom. They illustrate that even in the darkest holds of the Middle Passage, amidst overcrowding, disease, and despair, the human spirit could rise, unite, and act decisively against the forces arrayed to crush it. The Amistad and other uprisings are enduring reminders that resistance took many forms: bold, subtle, and strategic, and that the courage of those who dared to act continues to inspire generations long after the waves of the Atlantic have settled. These stories, interwoven with countless acts of defiance, reveal a persistent truth: freedom was never surrendered quietly, and the quest to reclaim it shaped history in ways that echo far beyond the decks of any single ship. Behind every act of resistance at sea lay the invisible threads of leadership, strategy, and human connection, elements as vital to survival as courage itself. The revolts that erupted on the decks of slave ships were rarely spontaneous bursts of violence. They were the product of careful observation, secret planning, and the guidance of individuals who could inspire trust and loyalty among their fellow captives. These leaders, often young men or women who had retained the sharpness of mind and strength of character despite the brutal conditions of captivity, became the linchpins of rebellion, capable of seeing opportunities where others saw only despair. Through whispered conversations in the shadows, gestures hidden in plain sight, and subtle signals passed from one person to another, they built networks of communication that could evade the ever-watchful eyes of the crew. The act of organizing such a revolt demanded extraordinary skill. Leaders had to know the routines of the sailors, the vulnerabilities of the ship, and the limits of the enslaved people's physical and mental endurance. They had to balance urgency with patience, deciding when to strike and when to wait, knowing that a single misstep could result in immediate punishment or death. Trust was paramount. A betrayal or a miscommunication could unravel even the most carefully laid plans. Within the claustrophobic and oppressive confines of the ship's hold, small gestures, a nod, a shared glance, a whispered word carried immense weight. Transmitting hope, coordination, and resolve in a world designed to suppress both. These leaders also had to inspire courage in others who had endured days, weeks, or months of terror, exhaustion, and dehumanization. To convince someone to risk everything for the chance of freedom required more than words. It required the projection of confidence, the demonstration of decisiveness, and the ability to make each person feel seen and essential to the plan. Every revolt depended on a delicate balance of authority and camaraderie, where each participant understood both the stakes and the possibility of triumph. The bonds forged in these moments of shared defiance were often as critical as the physical acts of resistance themselves, creating a sense of solidarity that could carry the group through the most desperate moments. When these meticulously coordinated efforts unfolded, the results could be astonishing. Ships were overtaken, crews were disarmed, and for fleeting but transformative moments, the enslaved reclaimed control over their destinies. Even when a revolt was ultimately suppressed, the strategies employed, the courage exhibited, and the cohesion of those involved left indelible marks on history. The very existence of these uprisings challenged the assumption that enslaved people could be completely dominated, revealing instead a humanity that was persistent, adaptive, and resolute. Ultimately, the role of leadership in resistance at sea underscores the depth of intellect, bravery, and ingenuity that defined these acts of defiance. It was through careful planning, subtle communication, and unwavering trust in one another that individuals facing unimaginable oppression could seize moments of autonomy, however brief, and strike back against the forces seeking to strip them of freedom. These stories reveal that even in the darkest conditions, courage alone was not enough. It was the combination of vision, organization, and collective will that transformed acts of desperation into remarkable demonstrations of human resilience, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire long after the ships have vanished into history. The very environment in which enslaved Africans were forced to live and travel made any act of defiance a staggering risk, as the ships themselves were carefully designed to suppress resistance and maintain control. Below deck, the enslaved were shackled, their movements restricted by heavy chains that cut into their flesh and reminded them constantly of their lack of freedom. Guards patrolled the narrow aisles relentlessly, armed and alert, trained to respond to the slightest hint of unrest with swift and brutal force. Every plank, every hatch, and every confined space was structured to prevent rebellion, creating a labyrinthine prison that sought to crush hope before it could even form. Despite these oppressive measures, the human spirit persisted in seeking freedom. Revolts often unfolded as tense, chaotic confrontations in which enslaved people had to overcome not only physical barriers, but the weight of fear itself. The stakes were impossibly high. A failed attempt could result in severe punishment, maiming, or death. Yet the courage displayed in these moments speaks to a profound refusal to accept captivity without challenge. Some uprisings relied on speed and surprise, with groups coordinating attacks on the crew when opportunities arose, striking with whatever makeshift weapons or tools they could seize. Even in failure, these efforts demonstrated a striking resilience and determination, revealing that the instinct for freedom could not be extinguished by chains or walls. The layout of the ships, however, made resistance a formidable endeavor. Cramped holds left little room to maneuver, and the close proximity of armed sailors meant that every move had to be calculated with extraordinary care. The enslaved had to exploit minute lapses in vigilance, anticipate patrol patterns, and communicate in silence, relying on intuition and observation to orchestrate their defiance. The combination of physical confinement, the constant threat of violence, and the psychological weight of isolation created conditions that would have broken many. Yet countless individuals found ways to resist, whether through fleeting acts of sabotage, coordinated revolt, or subtle forms of passive defiance. Tragically, many uprisings did end in devastation. Those who attempted to seize control of the ship often faced lethal retaliation, as captains and crews used brutal methods to reassert dominance. Punishments were severe and public, intended not only to discipline but to instill fear among others and suppress future acts of rebellion. Yet even amid such risks, the enslaved persisted in seeking ways to reclaim agency, their courage shining through despite the overwhelming odds. Each revolt, whether successful or crushed, left an indelible mark on history, a testament to the ingenuity, bravery, and unyielding spirit of those who refused to remain passive in the face of oppression. Ultimately, the heavy shackles, confined spaces, and armed guards underscore the immense challenges enslaved Africans faced during the Middle Passage. They also highlight the extraordinary nature of every act of resistance, revealing that even in the most controlled and dangerous environments, people could find ways to assert their autonomy and humanity. The stories of these revolts remind us that courage is often most profound not when it guarantees victory, but when it persists in the face of almost certain failure, and that the drive for freedom can never be fully contained, no matter how meticulously oppression is engineered. Although many acts of resistance at sea were met with overwhelming force, a small number of revolts achieved outcomes that reshaped lives and altered history. Among them, the Amistad stands as a powerful reminder that even within a system designed to crush defiance, freedom was sometimes seized and defended. After taking control of the ship, the Africans aboard did not simply survive the immediate danger. Their struggle continued on land, unfolding in courts and public debates that forced the world to confront the realities of captivity and human rights. What began as a desperate act of survival at sea evolved into a legal battle that affirmed their humanity and ultimately secured their freedom, transforming individual courage into a lasting historical milestone. The significance of such victories extended far beyond the people directly involved. News of successful resistance traveled along trade routes, through ports, and across communities, carried by sailors, merchants, and abolitionists alike. These stories became symbols of possibility, quietly undermining the belief that captivity was inevitable or absolute. For enslaved people elsewhere, whether on ships, plantations, or in holding pens, the knowledge that others had risen, endured, and prevailed provided a rare but vital source of hope. It affirmed that resistance, even against immense odds, could lead not only to momentary defiance but to lasting change. These successes also exposed cracks in the systems that upheld the trade. Legal victories following maritime revolts forced courts, governments, and the public to grapple with uncomfortable truths about morality, justice, and human dignity. Testimonies from survivors humanized those who had long been reduced to cargo, shifting public perception and strengthening abolitionist movements. Each case that ended in freedom challenged the narratives used to justify exploitation and reminded the world that the enslaved were not passive subjects of history, but active participants shaping their own destinies. The inspirational power of these revolts lay not only in their outcomes but in their meaning. They demonstrated that unity, leadership, and courage could overcome even the most carefully constructed systems of control. The image of enslaved Africans standing together, asserting their right to freedom before courts and nations, resonated deeply with others still in bondage. It encouraged subtle forms of resistance, strengthened communal bonds, and kept alive the belief that liberation was possible, even if distant. Over time, these stories accumulated, forming a legacy of resistance that transcended individual ships or voyages. They became part of a broader narrative that connected maritime uprisings to struggles on land, linking acts of defiance across oceans and generations. Each successful revolt added weight to the argument that enslavement was neither natural nor uncontested, and that the desire for freedom was universal and irrepressible. In remembering these moments, it becomes clear that their true power lies in how they transformed fear into resolve and isolation into solidarity. The freedom gained by some did not erase the suffering endured by many, but it illuminated a path forward, proving that resistance could echo far beyond the decks where it began. These victories at sea stand as enduring testaments to the resilience of the human spirit and to the profound impact that courage, once ignited, can have on countless lives still yearning for freedom. When resistance surfaced aboard slave ships, the response from the crew was swift and intended to extinguish any further challenge to their authority. These vessels operated on fear as much as force, and captains understood that even a brief uprising threatened not only their control but the entire logic of the trade. As a result, failed revolts were met with harsh disciplinary measures designed to send an unmistakable message to everyone still confined below deck. Order was reasserted through intimidation, public punishment, and calculated displays of dominance, all carefully staged to discourage any future attempt at defiance. For those who survived these failed efforts, the aftermath could be as crushing as the revolt itself. The ship became an even more oppressive space, where vigilance increased and trust was constantly tested. Survivors were often isolated, watched closely, and subjected to measures meant to break their resolve and spread fear among others. These tactics were not random acts of cruelty, but deliberate strategies aimed at preventing unity, dismantling leadership, and restoring absolute control. By turning the consequences of resistance into a warning, crews sought to ensure silence and submission for the remainder of the voyage. Yet even in these moments, something remarkable endured: the memory of resistance, though punished, could not be erased. Witnessing the courage of those who dared to act left a profound impression on others, embedding quiet defiance into collective memory. Even when outward resistance was suppressed, inward resolve often remained intact. Enslaved people learned, adapted, and remembered, carrying these lessons with them long after the ships reached their destinations. The effort to terrorize may have imposed temporary obedience, but it could not fully extinguish the awareness that resistance was possible. The psychological toll of these reprisals was immense. Life aboard the ship became defined by heightened tension, where every movement was monitored and every interaction scrutinized. Yet this atmosphere also revealed the fragility of the system itself. The extreme measures required to maintain control exposed the fear that captains and crews harbored toward those they sought to dominate. Resistance, even when unsuccessful, forced the oppressors to acknowledge the humanity, intelligence, and determination of the people they attempted to reduce to silence. These responses to revolt also shaped how resistance evolved over time. As open uprisings were met with severe retaliation, many enslaved people turned increasingly towards subtle and indirect forms of defiance, acts that were harder to detect but no less meaningful. Quiet refusals, coded communication, and small disruptions became ways to preserve dignity and autonomy within a hostile environment. The lessons learned from failed revolts informed future resistance, contributing to a broader legacy of adaptation and resilience. In the broader narrative of resistance at sea, these moments of suppression are inseparable from the acts of courage that preceded them. They reveal the lengths to which the system went to preserve itself and, paradoxically, highlight the power of resistance to unsettle it. Each harsh response underscored the truth that domination was never secure, that fear existed on both sides of the chains. Ultimately, the terror imposed after failed revolts stands as a stark reminder of the risks enslaved Africans faced when they chose to resist. Yet it also affirms the depth of their courage. To challenge such a system, knowing the likely consequences, required extraordinary resolve. These stories, woven into the larger history of resistance at sea, remind us that even when repression followed, the act of defiance itself carried meaning. It affirmed humanity, asserted agency, and ensured that the desire for freedom, though punished, was never silenced. As this journey through resistance at sea comes to a close, one truth stands above all others. The story of enslaved Africans is not only a story of suffering, but also one of remarkable resilience and an unwavering refusal to accept oppression as fate. In the darkest confines of slave ships, under conditions designed to erase identity and hope, people still found the strength to resist, whether through open revolts, careful planning, or quiet acts of defiance. They asserted their humanity in ways that history can never ignore. These acts remind us that resistance was not an exception, but a persistent thread woven through the experience of captivity. The courage displayed on these voyages did more than challenge authority in the moment. It reshaped how the world understood the slave trade itself. Stories of uprisings, survival, and legal victories traveled far beyond the decks of the ships, reaching audiences who could no longer dismiss enslavement as a distant or abstract practice. Abolitionists drew upon these accounts to expose the inhumanity of the system, using real lives and real voices to confront society with uncomfortable truths. Each act of resistance became evidence that those who were enslaved were not passive victims, but thinking, feeling individuals who demanded recognition and justice. Over time, these narratives helped shift public perception and strengthen movements that sought to end the trade altogether. The bravery of enslaved Africans forced moral questions into the open and challenged long-held assumptions about power and control. Even when resistance did not lead directly to freedom, it left behind a powerful legacy, one that influenced laws, inspired activism, and shaped the ongoing struggle for human rights. The echoes of these acts can still be felt today, reminding us that progress is often driven by those who dare to resist injustice, even when the cost is high. Above all, resistance at sea symbolizes courage and agency in its purest form. It shows us that even in circumstances of extreme confinement and danger, people retained the ability to choose, to act, and to hope. These stories honor the strength of individuals who refuse to surrender their dignity, proving that the desire for freedom is one of the most powerful forces in human history. Their legacy challenges us to remember not only what was taken from them, but also what they fought to preserve. Thank you for spending this time with us and for listening to these important stories. If you found this journey meaningful, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these voices alive and ensures that the lessons of resilience, courage, and humanity continue to be shared with the world.